Two hurricanes continue to interact off the East Coast. Meanwhile, the Northeast braces for October chill, ushered in by gusty northeasterlies and high pressure from Quebec. Heat continues to bake the southern plains. Meanwhile, the Pacific Northwest gets battered by a seemingly endless line of Pacific systems. And tomorrow, the calendar changes to October, and we start to feel the approach of the holidays and another winter ahead. Looking at our tropical weather situation, Hurricane Umberto, 300 miles west of Bermuda, steady at 80 miles an hour. It is moving to the north at 17 miles an hour. It will pass north of Bermuda. That's that little speck right there. Hurricane Imelda, about 700 miles west-southwest of Bermuda, strengthening slowly to 85 miles an hour, moving east-northeast, and it is tracking directly towards Bermuda. Let's take a look at the GFS forecast from 12Z, and I've got Bermuda circled, so no question where it is. There's Umberto, and there's Imelda. So we move forward through the evening and into tomorrow. There's Imelda taking a track just south of the island. Now, the NHC forecast did originally have that north of the island. They now have a direct hit, which is somewhat fortunate if you take a look at the wind field. Remember, we have Bermuda right there. Now watch the storm approach. You can see that the strongest winds are on the right-hand side of the track. So it's good to have that down to the south when it's passing directly over the island. So there will be some damage there, but I think if that trend holds, some of the stronger winds will remain south of the island. Now, Bermuda is not immune to getting tropical cyclones. They've had hundreds of storm events over the past couple of centuries, dozens in the past 20 years. So they are used to it, and this is a Category 2 storm. So unless there is surprise intensification, I think the potential for widespread damage should be rather limited. Let's switch over to the IVT and look at the extended, checking out the Gulf, the Caribbean. Well, we can't see too far there. There is one disturbance that appears to come together along the Gulf Coast around Sunday, just a weak little tropical disturbance that will spread some showers inland Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. Then for the rest of the period, here comes another little tropical wave that crosses Florida around the middle of the week. And there could be something trying to brew around the Yucatan, the Bay of Campeche, in the extended. I don't have the charts set up for that, but we will have to keep an eye on that in case something comes together. But that's still over a week away. So we'll be returning to a quiet weather pattern in the tropics in just a couple of days. Looking at the weather map across the country, how do we analyze this? Well, what we see up here is high pressure in Canada, a gradient that decreases down towards the Gulf and then implies northerly flow. So it's very hard to get a buildup of moisture across much of the eastern U.S. We keep infiltrating dry air from the north. So dew points are kind of depressed in the 50s and 60s. There is some evapotranspiration and some tropical moisture has reached the Piedmont region and parts of the deep south, but Texas, 50s dew points, very pleasant, 50s all the way up in spite of the deep southerly flow. In the West Coast area, we've got two weather systems, one moving through the northern Rockies and this large occlusion moving onto the West Coast. The main Bear Clinic area west of California. So this is all an occlusion, and the upper jet is running somewhat like this. The general upper-level flow shows an upper vortex west of Vancouver Island, 534 decameters on that upper-level height. We do have ridging through the Great Lakes into the Midwest and into the Mississippi River Valley. That's associated with a very warm air mass. That ridging extends into the Hudson Bay region and into Nunavut. Troughing off of the East Coast, associated with that stormy weather pattern. And what else do we got? The main subtropical high well to the south, and that puts all of the country under westerly flow. Of course, some areas are more northerly, but overall, This is an absence of a deep easterly tropical weather pattern that is typical of the late summer. And let's zoom in a little bit and look at the dynamics. We add the vorticity overprint. Absolute vorticity tells us where the flow is out of balance due to ageostrophic processes. We're talking about baroclinic weather systems, that kind of thing, and mid-level disturbances transiting the flow. So what we have here, looking at the general height pattern, we've got a mega block. So that's going to help keep the pattern locked up at least a few days. There's those systems, the twins, Imelda and Umberto. And what else do we have here? Some troughing across Oklahoma and Texas. That's that disturbance that was crossing New Mexico and West Texas yesterday. So going forward, you can see this bowling ball up there off of Vancouver Island. There are some stronger dynamics that will be coming into California around Thursday. And there it is. Big shortwave, probably a jet max heading into central California. That'll be associated with organization of that front in the western U.S., and that will bring a baroclinic weather system into the Great Basin and into the Rockies late in the week. And that will cross over into the Central Plains, and we'll see some of that weather heading up into Minnesota and the Dakotas. Could see some severe weather in places like Nebraska, South Dakota on Saturday, and possibly Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa for Sunday. Here comes round 2 for the start of next week. That will dig into California and sit out there for a little while, and then gradually move along that same track into the northern plains once again. So it's kind of like a broken record for that part of the country, but down south, the subtropical ridge making a reappearance, and that means a spell of very warm weather through the deep south. With the prospect of severe weather this weekend in the northern plains, we do need to take a look at the composite. This is 850 millibars, about 5,000 feet. And we show very limited moisture. Notice the mixing ratio is on the order of 6 to 8. So we're talking about dew points in the 40s and 50s. So let's bring this forward. We do have a low-level jet. And we go to Thursday. Nothing going on really. Just lackluster southerly flow. It starts picking up around Friday. And then things really get going for Friday night. So there's a 55-knot low-level jet. Any moisture... well, it doesn't look all that great. Look upstream. It is very limited. That's due to that anticyclonic flow. Some of that dry air has been pushing out into the Gulf Coast region. So are we going to pull things together for Saturday and Sunday? It's going to be very iffy, I think. Definite good dynamics. If anything gets going, I think there's the potential for some strong convection. So we're looking at 8 grams per kilogram, 10 up there in Manitoba, and that lifts northward. Very limited dynamics, I think, for Sunday. That's Sunday at 1 p.m. So some of that upper level lift may outrun the surface systems on Sunday. There will be a front through that area, but it's a little bit unclear what's going to be happening exactly in that part of the country. The better moisture well to the south, so overall this is telling us that moisture is going to be a problem. We still can get high-based convection and some localized convergence of the moisture field up there in the northern plains. So we'll just have to see what that looks like when we come back for Friday. But down there in the Gulf Coast region, yeah, there's going to be a disturbance right there over New Orleans. Good moisture advection into the deep south, so good possibility of showers and storms all through this area. In the northeast, cold advection setting up across the St. Lawrence Valley into New England. Temperatures up to the north in the 40s across much of Quebec. That would be pushing cold air into much of the northeastern U.S. The cold advection associated with dry air and clear skies, so we're going to get some strong radiational cooling tonight. We have freeze warnings out tonight for all of northern New Hampshire, including Berlin. Temperatures will drop into the upper 20s. Frost advisories across western Maine into much of New Hampshire. Also, a freeze watch for tomorrow night in upstate New York for the Adirondacks and the Catskills. Temperatures will drop into the upper 20s there. Again, that's for tomorrow night. The The Great Lakes also getting some of that cool air in northeast Michigan, temperatures down into the 60s, but we find 80s from western Michigan into the Midwest, and close to 90 this afternoon from Paducah to Davenport. Hurricanes are close at hand in the southeast. No special warnings or watches in effect on the landmass, but offshore in the coastal areas, high surf advisories from Virginia all the way down to West Palm Beach. The North Carolina Outer Banks right in here, they have gale warnings and wind advisories through Wednesday, and coastal flood warnings, which will remain in effect through Friday. Temperatures in the Carolinas in the 70s, increasing to 80s in Florida and Georgia, with 90s in Mississippi up to Memphis. Checking out the southern plains, if you were paying attention to those upper air charts, you remember that there was a trough going through Oklahoma, and we've got that cloud field right ahead of it. We might be able to see that on the water vapor imagery. Yeah, there it is. Even a little vortex out there around Greenville and Bonham, Texas. A dry slot working in behind it across East Texas, and we get back into the prevailing westerlies further to the west. Going back to the visible satellite imagery, we saw mostly 80s across the southern plains. We did have 90s from Houston to San Antonio and down to the lower Rio Grande Valley. In the northern plains, they were just to the west of that large ridge covering the Great Lakes area. One little trough, but mostly mid and upper level clouds. Temperatures were in the 80s just about everywhere, except for 60s on Lake Superior and 70s across northern Minnesota. The hot spot, that would have to be Rapid City, approaching 90 degrees. Towards the Rockies, we had mild weather, around 80 in the I-25 corridor, and 60s and 70s in the central Rockies. Across the southwestern U.S., a little bit stormy in Utah, a trough moving across Utah, producing some showers and storms in the central and northeast part of the state. The southwest ranged from 70s in New Mexico and the Four Corners to mid-90s in the lower deserts, 70s and 80s in the San Joaquin Valley and Inland Empire, 70s on the California coast. You can see some stormy weather coming in there off the left side of the frame with clouds. We've got strengthening wind fields, and you can see the transverse banding right there in California and Nevada as those winds come up. We do have wind advisories in effect for today for Lake Tahoe, Pyramid Lake, and across southern Oregon near Lakeview. Southwest winds 35 to 45 miles an hour will be possible through the remainder of today. And finally, on the Pacific Northwest frame, there's that large occluded front. Cold advection working in behind it, and a vortex probably vertically stacked west of Vancouver Island. Looks like possibly a little sting jet right there. Probably some very strong gusty winds coming back in behind that vortex. Let's take a look at the water vapor imagery, because that's going to be a little bit spectacular in this kind of situation. Yeah, there's a little vortex right there. Large area of dry advection coming in behind the occluded front. And just a quick summary of the weather in that part of the country. We had temperatures in the mid-60s on the Pacific coast underneath that cloud cover, mid-70s in the Columbia and Snake River Valley, and gale warnings all along the Oregon and Washington coast. That includes the Bellingham area of the, I'm not sure if that's the Strait of San Juan de Fuca. There's some strait in here that name has eluded me at the moment. Anyway, the whole area getting southeast winds 30 to 40 knots and more southerly further south. So there is the surface analysis for how all that is structured. Let's head north into Alaska. It is a little bit quieter there in the Gulf of Alaska, the Bering Sea, getting some strong westerly flow. A new frontal system moving into southeastern Alaska. Temperatures are continuing to drop down to 19 in the Brooks Range, 20s on the North Slope and in western Alaska, and 30s elsewhere. Let's take a look at northern Canada, because a lot of our changes this time of year start coming from there. Now, there is a big change way up in the Canadian High Arctic. Look at that, 0 at Eureka. I don't think we've seen anything that cold yet. Certainly nothing below 0. 16 at Thule, 32 at Resolute. They've had some warm northerly or southerly advection come up, bring some of that mid-latitude air up into the Arctic region. And no warnings for Canada as well. There is a frost warning or frost advisory for parts of western Quebec and eastern Ontario. They are also in that area of cold advection. The rest of the country, though, looking pretty good, and just the typical garden variety rain on the British Columbia coast. A quick check of the high temperatures. This is what we have for today. 80s all the way up to the Dakotas. Much cooler in the Pacific Northwest, 60s and 70s there. For tomorrow, pretty much the same story for the central U.S. More heat up north for Thursday, and it just gets worse going into Friday. Those are some very hot temperatures, up to 91 around Sioux Falls and whatever that city there is in southern Minnesota. The ECMWF has some of these temperatures near the all-time climatological maximums, so this is certainly a significant event. Further south, mid-90s showing up in Texas, but thankfully no 100s in the Arizona desert. For Saturday, some cooling coming in from the west all through this area, and it works further into the Great Plains, although it is very sluggish. Still hanging on to those 80s into Wisconsin all the way into Sunday and possibly into Monday as far as Chicago. Let's take a look at those lows for tonight. There's those 30s and 40s up there in New England, 30s and 40s across the Rockies. These cold temperatures advance even further south for Thursday, and you can see 50s all the way to the Piedmont region, and for Friday, 50s all the way to Atlanta and Macon. Some very cool weather in the high deserts of the Great Basin, down to 28 there at Burns, and even colder for Saturday night. Look at that, lots of 20s in Montana, 30s all the way through the Great Basin area, 42 at Tonopah, 63 at Las Vegas. That's pretty cool. It's cooler than most places in Texas except Amarillo. And Monday, wow, really cools down. Cold air working south, 20s and 30s. All right, let's look at that forecast again. A very cold night in the northeastern U.S. We go into tomorrow. That ridging holds across the Midwest, some very warm temperatures there. Then for Thursday, we're looking at some very hot temperatures in the Corn Belt, upper 80s to low 90s from Champaign to Rapid City, Texas, likewise in the Furnace. But it will be cold east of the Appalachians with that ridging, and there is some high pressure right there. So 40s and 50s for much of the East Coast region. For Friday, continued hot in the Great Plains, 90s from Texas to western Kansas to southwestern Minnesota, 80s into Wisconsin. High temperatures this time of year should be in the 60s in Wisconsin. For Saturday, the upper ridge starts to advance into the East Coast region, so we will have a pretty rapid warm-up. Major weather system in the northern plains, and that will lift into Minnesota, Ontario. And there we could see some severe weather. I would think that would be more likely on Saturday. Sunday is a little bit more indeterminate. Another system coming together on the west coast, and that will take a few days to come together. But there it is. It begins crossing the Rockies, and by midweek appears in Wyoming and Colorado. And this again will mostly influence the central and northern plains, very little for the southern U.S. And that will be all for this edition of Forecast Lab. Thank you very much for joining us, and if you enjoyed the program, please post a comment and let us know. And I almost never say this, but please like and subscribe. And of course, as I mentioned, please comment as well. All of that helps the program. So even if you're not a Patreon supporter, you can pitch in and keep this program going in other ways. All right, we'll see you back here on Friday for another edition of the show. Have a great middle of your week. Bye-bye.